The sun is shining, the birds are chirping, the bacon is sizzling. Welcome to the Daily Swole.
Welcome everyone to episode 80 of the Daily Mother Swole. It's Monday, so we're going to start off with some sick fucking gains talking about shoulders like boulders. So how do you get big shoulders? What's the importance of big shoulders? Why is that a challenge point for a lot of people? The big thing about shoulders is that it's very important to the physique. It creates that V taper, it creates that width, it creates that broad look when you create that shoulder cap. Now, shoulders can actually be a positive influence on the physique, or it could be a negative, it could be a detriment. For example, if someone has too much anterior shoulder and they've developed too much of their the front of their shoulder, it can round them, it can curve the shoulders in, it can make the person look slumped, it can make the chest look tinier, it can bring the upper body into a crossed position, upper cross syndrome is what it's called, with the shoulders rounded inwards. And too much development can make the back look tinier in comparison. So a shoulder is important from the sides as a component to the arm, but also from the front and from the back. So what you have to know about the shoulders is three parts. There's the anterior, the medial head, or the lateral, and there's also the posterior. And one of the things that's important about the shoulder is the posterior rotator cuff and the posterior deltoid are often undertrained. So if you want to create a nice shoulder, a nice round, a boulder shoulder, so to speak, you need to create that round shape. You need to create that balance. So hitting the back part of the shoulder is super important. And no matter what I do, I always focus more on the back than the front, because the front always gets work, usually with chest pressing and any kind of overhead movement. The front gets a lot of activity. So I focus mostly on the side and the rear rather than nailing the front with tons of front raises and overhead presses, which I'm not a huge fan of in general, just because of the imbalance that most people have. I work on the compensation. I work on the weaker points that are going to be generally in the physique, and I let my body will balance itself out naturally that way. Another aspect is the medial deltoid. So really, the back and the front of the back and the side of the shoulder are going to give more of a large appearance than the front. And I'm not saying the front's not important. I'm just saying that if you focus more on the side and the rear, the front will kind of come into its own, because the front is worked during chest. The back of the shoulder isn't necessarily hit as much during back movements as you would think, just because when you're doing back, you're working a lot more lats. You're not isolating that lateral or that posterior head as much. And the lateral deltoid doesn't really get hit in any certain movements, just maybe works as a stabilizer of the rotator cuff. So in order to create that real big shoulder appearance, the side and the rear are very important. So bigger shoulders will create more of a V taper. It'll make the waist smaller in comparison. So even females, if you're looking to increase your or decrease the size of your waist and that slender hourglass figure, definition of the shoulders is actually very important, because it gives you that more of a curved look, because it gives you a little more width in your upper body. Not saying you want to look bulky. Shoulders are also important because they stabilize for the chest exercise, for the back exercises, but the shoulder is a ball and socket joint, so that balance is super important, because if there's an imbalance, if there's more action in the front, if there's too much anterior deltoid, in general, the body will be pulling that humerus, pulling your shoulder forward, the actual humerus bone, and you'll be getting a lot more grinding in the front. You get a lot more shoulder impingements, issues. One of the ways to tell if you have an impingement is to take your arm, cross it over onto your opposite shoulder, and elevate your elbow. And if you feel a pain or a pinching as you raise your elbow in front of your face, that might allude to that you have a shoulder impingement, meaning you have a smaller space in the shoulder joint where the rotator cuff muscle is getting pinched, and that can lead to some inflammation and injury down the line, potentially. So the posterior cuff, the posterior cap of the shoulder, is really where you want to develop. So in terms of a 3D physique, in terms of creating an aesthetic appearance, now I'm not just talking about in terms of strength, which is important because the shoulder is a muscle, but in terms of creating a 3D appearance, you want to work the side and the rear mostly in order to create the common balance of the anterior, because the anterior is generally going to be more developed naturally, just because you're always doing stuff in the front, you're always typing, you're always at the computer, you're always rounded forward, so those anterior deltoids and the rounding of the shoulders usually occurs. So posture, pulling the shoulders back, sitting up nice and tall, retracting during those posterior deltoid movements, and the lateral raises, for example, are super important. One of the reasons why people have trouble developing the shoulders is because during the day in the life of a human being, every muscle has its job. Every muscle is comprised of different types of fibers that allow the muscle to do work. Some muscles are comprised more of fast twitch fibers to produce force, and some muscles are more comprised of slow twitch that allow endurance, like the diaphragm or the calves and the forearms, which produce a lot of activity all the time. The body needs those muscles to be able to contract for long periods of time and not burn out really quickly. It would be terrible if your diaphragm, the respiratory muscle, was fast twitch and you'd have one breath and burn out like a sprint, like a max rep. That'd be terrible. We wouldn't be able to live. So slow twitch fibers, the diaphragm flattening and allowing the space in the thoracic cavity to change volume so the air can rush in and out from the atmosphere, that allows us to breathe all the time, even when we're sleeping nonstop. So the deltoids, because the shoulders are used during every movement, like even when we're not doing anything really active, we're still kind of using our shoulders. You're reaching for the remote control. You're still using muscles in the deltoid. The outer cuff, the muscles you can see are fast twitch fibers. The posterior, medial head, and also the anterior are fast twitch fibers. They produce more force. The muscles that are underneath, the rotator cuff, those are the slow twitch fibers. Those are the muscles that get injured. When you hurt your shoulder, you're not hurting your deltoid. You're not hurting the muscles you can see. You're hurting the muscles on the inside. There's these tiny little muscles that grasp onto the head of the humerus that keep it in place in the shoulder socket. So if you looked at an anatomical picture, you'll see that these tiny muscles underneath, then you have the deltoid on top of it that everyone sees on the outside. So for the first 10, 15 degrees of motion, it's pretty much all rotator cuff work. So it's very important to do a combination of higher repetitions and lower repetitions, as well as rotational movements with cables and with bands in order to activate the rotator cuff muscles. This will ensure that you have more balance. That's why I like working the medial head, and I like working the posterior with posterior rotator cuff work, because those are the things that missing in the physique, the side and the rear deltoid. You see a lot of people with the sloped shoulders because they have nothing in the back. They're all rounded forward. They're all anterior deltoids. Muscle guys are all front shoulder from benching and doing front raise, mirror muscles, doing only the way they can see. But more importantly than what you can see is the missing pieces underneath, the missing parts of the rotator cuff that are not being worked as a result of that as well. So you have to isolate the rotator cuff by doing rotation movements with a cable, with a band, and some things that I will show when I do my shoulder workout on Periscope, and I put on YouTube. You'll see when I do my shoulder routine, I'll do some posterior rotator cuff. I'll start doing some broadcasting for shoulder rehabilitation. But those exercises are the ones that are going to prevent injury. And those are the ones that are going to provide you that well-balanced 3D physique. Because what can happen if you don't have a balanced shoulder and you have too much anterior, you're going to have that sloped, lopsided look. And you're going to look like one of those meathead bodybuilders. If you have side and you have posterior deltoid, like I do, if you have the side and the rear, you have a more powerful, you have a more well-rounded, you have a better postural physique, you have better balance. It's very aesthetically pleasing to the eye for someone that has a shoulder cap, for someone that has a balanced shoulder. I'm not saying you have to be a massive bodybuilder, but to have development on the back of your arm, on your upper arm, it's aesthetically pleasing for a reason, because the human body can sense balance by just automatically, subconsciously scanning over the body. But it also prevents shoulder injury. So it creates that aesthetic purpose and also creates that functional purpose that will help stabilize even pressing movements. So you're doing bench pressing, posterior rotator cuff will help bench pressing. It'll help release pressure in the shoulder joint if you create balance by working the posterior cuff. So when you do bench pressing and pressing movements, you'll be able to exert more force because there's more balance in the muscle. The joint is actually aligned properly and better in order to enact leverage through a bench press movement. And then you also have, just like I said, not just the function, you have the look. You have the appearance of a 3D front, side, and rear, a complete round boulder shoulder that will improve aesthetic appearance and improve just an overall physique. I'll stay for a few minutes after on Periscope and Busker. Thank you so much for joining episode 80. I wanted to do boulder shoulders because the 80 is like 2 round circles. So episode 80 of the Daily Swole. I will see everyone tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern time for episode 81 of the Daily Mother Swole. Have a great gaining Monday. Hit shoulders, hit chest, hit legs, hit something, eat well, and I will see everyone tomorrow at noon. Peace out.